You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Today, we're going to be talking about greedflation. This is the idea that some companies are exploiting the cost of living crisis in order to drive their own profits. And now, the supermarkets are in the firing line. Earlier this week, executives from Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, and Morrisons appeared before UK lawmakers who are alleging that the grocers are profiteering and acting as a cartel. Even the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said this week that food prices have gone up far too much in recent months, and now the government wants to make sure that supermarkets are behaving responsibly and fairly when it comes to pricing. So, how have the supermarkets responded to these claims? Naturally, they're vehemently rejecting them. They say UK grocery retail is incredibly competitive. In fact, Tesco's commercial director, Gordon Gaffa, told MPs, "We are the most competitive we have ever been." And I'd agree with that. Everything the supermarkets do, they do it with a customer in mind. They are far too aware of the consequences of not being competitive on price. They made that mistake already. They made that mistake 10, 15 years ago, and it paved the way for the discounters. Aldi and Lidl have grown and stolen market share over the past decade, and now Aldi is the fourth largest supermarket, bigger than Morrisons. So if you're not doing your absolute best, particularly in the current climate, if you're not doing your absolute best to offer value right now, then you don't have much of a business. It is absolutely cutthroat. Shoppers are more price sensitive and less loyal than ever before. Now, that doesn't mean that prices aren't a problem. They are. The latest data from the ONS shows that food price inflation is currently at around 18%. This is the highest level since the 1970s. And I think as shoppers, it's incredibly visible. We all notice these changes. In fact, I noticed recently that a large pack of fish fingers, which is very much a barometer for inflation in our household, no judgment. A large pack of fish fingers, though, now costs almost £8. Now, I'm sure it used to be about £4, maybe 5, but definitely in that range. Sugar is up 50%. Cheddar cheese costs 40% more than it did last year. Eggs, 30% more. But to go back to the profiteering claim, I don't think you can just point your finger at the supermarkets and say that they're lining their pockets at the expense of the shopper. This is a complex situation. And let's not forget, there's been a lot of disruption over the past few years. It's volatile. We've had Brexit, then COVID, then the Ukraine war, all of which, for varying reasons, have contributed to food price inflation. The supermarkets have had to contend with their own cost inflation: energy, transport, labor, rent, higher manufacturer prices, higher commodity prices. For the grocers, the cost of doing business is considerably greater and far more volatile than it used to be. And of course, this is a sector with razor-thin margins. If you look at another category like clothing or electronics, these are categories where you have nice, cushy margins that you can play around with if you need to. That's not the case in grocery. In grocery, we're talking low single digits. Very, very low single digits. And of course, the last thing that any retailer wants to do is to pass any additional cost on to the customer. In my view, the supermarkets have actually done everything in their power to continue to offer value to customers in these trying times. They've expanded their economy private label ranges. They've invested in lower prices where they can. They're price matching the discounters. They're offering special discounts and lower prices to members of their loyalty schemes. That's relatively new. They're doing whatever they can to reduce their own costs. I mean, some are even dimming lights to reduce energy costs. That's where we are right now. So my take is no. The supermarkets aren't profiteering. They're balancing the need to remain competitive and serve the customer while still protecting their inherently small profit margins. So, if the government is wrong and supermarkets aren't responsible for skyrocketing inflation, well, then who is? To help us make sense of it all, Javier Dillon joins us on the podcast. Javier is an economist with the BRC, the British Retail Consortium, and I thought he'd be the perfect person to help us unpack what's going on. Javier, welcome. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Javier, I referenced the ONS data in my intro, but the BRC, of course, has its own shop price index, which is produced in collaboration with Nielsen IQ. Now, the index measures changes in the price of 500 of the most commonly bought items, which is especially relevant this week because I think it really shows the extent to which retailers are contributing to inflation. Now, you've just released the June data, so can you talk us through the main findings? And most importantly, whether you think that inflation has finally peaked?
Yeah, so inflation has finally turned a corner. We did note that shop price inflation finally eased from roughly around 9% to 8.4%, and we saw easing across both food and non-food categories. So good news there. Food is now coming down from its peak, and we anticipate that it will start to ease from now up until the end of the year. Now, how fast that process is going to be kind of at the whim of certain unknowns. So, commodity price volatility, the future inflation outlook, how quickly that inflation comes down is going to be at the whim of some factors that we still have some uncertainty around. But I think we can say with a good deal of confidence that inflation is largely on its way down.
Yeah, well, that's really promising news. And I think it is important to remind listeners who maybe aren't as well versed in all this that food prices themselves aren't declining. So we're not talking about deflation, but the rate at which prices are increasing is slowing. That's what's happening here. Now, you kind of already touched on your outlook, but I'm curious to know how I just to kind of go back to this deceleration in food inflation that you're predicting. We know that it's the lower income households that are disproportionately impacted by food price inflation because a larger share of their income goes to essentials like food. But I guess two questions. One is, do you think this is going to provide some much needed relief to lower income consumers? And then actually, you know what? We'll start with that question and then we'll move on to the next one before I throw too much at you.
So yeah, I mean, a slowdown in inflation will be welcomed by lower income consumers, but as you touched upon, whilst it's not deflation, i.e., falling prices, disinflation does mean that prices are at least stabilizing. So, in terms of budgeting and looking ahead into the future, in one sense, that is helpful. But yes, positive inflation still means that prices were higher than a year ago, just less so. But what I would suggest is that consumers have been remarkably resilient over the past year or so, and whether that's across income spectrums, that higher income households have been able to weather the storm a bit better. But in aggregate, retail spending has broadly held up fairly well, despite the active headwinds currently in the economy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that consumers have surprised us all with their resilience. Sure, they're being more cautious, they're being smarter in their spending and how they part with their hard earned cash. And there are, for obvious reasons, signs that they are delaying this big ticket discretionary purchases. But the fact is, they're still spending. And I think this is going to be really interesting to watch as we move into the second half of the year, the most critical time of year for retailers, because I think consumers' ability to continue to spend is really going to be put to the test. We continue to see interest rate rises, which are putting a real dent in purchasing power. In fact, I read recently that nearly 1.5 million people with mortgages will see a 20% reduction in their disposable income. 20%. I mean, this is going to have huge implications for retail. So, I think there's a lot at play. But I guess just to touch on the overall inflation rate, because the overall inflation rate obviously doesn't just include food, but all goods and the price of all goods and services, that is also stubbornly high at around 9%. So not as high as food price inflation, but I'm curious to get your views. To what extent does food price inflation contribute to this overall inflation figure? And if, as you say, the rate at which food prices are rising continues to decelerate, will the overall inflation figure come down to, or are there perhaps other factors that are propping that figure up?
So yes, as you say, overall inflation is still quite stubbornly high. In the BRC Nielsen IQ measure of shop price inflation, food contributes around 5% of that headline figure, whereas non-food accounts for a slightly lower amount at 3.5%. But food price inflation, I mean, clearly it's in double digits, whereas many of the non-food categories are still in single digits. So it's occupying the bulk of the inflationary pressures, if you will. Now, the kind of good news story is that fresh food inflation does look like it's easing a lot more rapidly than non fresh. So many staple items, bread, flour, milk, butter. These are items that we have recently begun to see price decreases in, price cuts in, and this is reflected in just how much the fresh component has slowed down. But we are still seeing some lingering inflationary pressures in ambient food products, and these sorts of products tend to have a bit more of a manufacturing process behind them. There are more inputs required, so naturally the cost base tends to be a bit higher in those sorts of goods, and especially when you put that in the context of a commodity such as sugar, which has been seeing
Mm.
exploding prices over the past 6 months or so. Sugar is a base ingredient for many items, and so particularly items such as chocolates might be a bit of a sad thing for myself, bit of a sweet tooth. That is an item that's going to see more persistent inflationary pressures. So certainly some things are coming down faster, but other things are coming down a lot more slowly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And just to kind of explore that in a little bit more detail. I mean, one of the things that the supermarkets were grilled over this week is why shop prices haven't fallen in line with drops in the wholesale cost of ingredients, which is what you've sort of just touched on. And they use the example of wheat. Going back to our friend Ken Murphy at Tesco, I mean, he said previously that they react pretty quickly when they see commodities coming down. But this week, we've heard from the supermarkets who have said that it typically takes anywhere between 3 to 9 months for a reduction in wholesale costs to translate into lower prices at the shelf. So, in your view, does it really take that long? And do you think some retailers are maybe more agile than others, or some better at implementing those declines in wholesale costs and in translating those into lower prices at the shelf?
When we've looked at this, we find the strongest correlations of end consumer prices. So that is to say, the prices that consumers face. The strongest correlations are between 8 and 18 months for global food prices. So, food coming in from abroad. And then
Mm,
we have that range at 3 to 9 months for producer prices, which is kind of a step further down the supply chain. So that's all to say that it takes time for these costs to filter through down the supply chain at the various stages of production. And what's worth mentioning is that retail has very frequent price setting in the sector. So it's one of the most agile sectors in the whole economy, and this allows them to adapt to the market quite quickly.
mm,
Competition is naturally fierce, so price growth has been evolving as cost bases continue to increase. So one thing that's been surprising to the upside has been that the labour aspect of costs. Not only is it, are there long lags to actually fill posts, the wage growth is also re-accelerating. So that there appears to be a bit more kind of pressure in the cost base still. But what I would say is that price cuts are coming. We've already seen examples of this in certain staple goods that I've mentioned, and the big supermarkets are always going to want to seek to grow their market share and will snatch the opportunity when they can.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, there's been talk of a supermarket price cap on essential items to help combat inflation, and something similar is being introduced in France. The UK supermarkets have broadly rejected this idea, saying that it can have unintended consequences. It might actually make the market less competitive, and actually, the market is pretty good at self-regulating. So, I'm curious to get your views. Would a supermarket price cap work? And if not, what else can be done to bring food prices down?
So I had a long Twitter thread about this not too long ago, and to put the answer shortly, no, I don't think a price cap would work. But a lot of the points I made were surrounding the price cap being unnecessary. So
Mm.
food inflation's already peaked, and the effect of a price cap would have been to force higher prices of certain goods. So certain goods, the staples, you would have had to reduce their prices or keep them at a certain level. That kind of price pressure would find itself in other goods inevitably, and also it would prevent further price cuts of those essentials because retailers are incentivized to price to the cap rather than their own market equilibrium price. So
Interesting.
this would put the government's target of halving inflation in a bit more jeopardy because if those goods that you would naturally see price cuts in have sort of stickier price levels, then that's going to slow down the disinflation that the government itself wants as its target. So and then another thing to kind of just add into the mix there is that prices did fall in May for many of the items that price caps did the price caps were considered for. So this does suggest that the controls were unnecessary to some degree. Those cuts were coming, and they are expected to continue as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it could actually backfire if not done correctly. Now, final question for you, Javier. The BRC is calling on the government to halt the introduction of new policies that might hamper the progress we've seen in terms of grocery prices easing. Can you talk us through what specifically might hinder these efforts to combat inflation?
So, a big part of why the pass through of costs is taking time, and this touches on a question you raised earlier about the kind of 3 to 9 month lag. A big part of why that pass through is taking time is because the business base of costs has swelled over the past few years. The tax burden is certainly much higher than it was during the 2010s, and following Brexit, there's been an increase in barriers to trade. So there are more kind of frictions. Just doing business is, there are more burdens in conducting that business. So all of this is to say that this additional cost base, this swelling cost base, is preventing retail businesses from investing as much in price cutting measures as they maybe could have had their cost bases been lower. And that's whether it's business rates, packaging regulations, and a host of other different regulations that are adding cost to retail businesses.
Fantastic. Well, I think that just about wraps it up. Javier, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights. It's been great to have you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.